Afternoon, sir. Detective Wallace, County Police. Mind if I ask you a couple questions?
Of course, anything I can help with?
Appreciate it. We had a call about something unusual on this block earlier. You've been home most of the day?
Yeah, just got back from a walk.
The afternoon sun slanted through the tall trees lining the street, casting long, stretched shadows across a quiet suburban neighborhood that rarely drew attention. This was the kind of place where days passed without incident, where routines repeated themselves with comforting predictability. Lawns were neatly trimmed. Cars rested quietly along the curb. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once, then fell silent. A man in a dark, tailored suit walked toward a modest, well-kept house at the end of the street. The keys in his right hand caught the light as he moved, his briefcase swinging gently at his side. His pace was unhurried, familiar. This wasn't a visit. This was home. He reached the front steps, lifting his foot onto the first stair. "Sir, step away from the property. I need to see your identification." The voice cut sharply through the calm, amplified by authority and suspicion. The man stopped mid-step, slowly, deliberately. He turned to face the uniformed officer standing a few yards behind him. The officer's posture was rigid, professional, one hand hovering near his holstered firearm as if already bracing for resistance that had not come. The street seemed to freeze. "Officer," the man said evenly, his voice calm but firm. "I live here. This is my home." For a moment, no one spoke. The breeze moved the leaves. A car passed at the far end of the block. It sounded distant and indifferent. "Am I being detained?" the man asked. The officer did not answer. And in that silence, what should have been an ordinary return home quietly became something else entirely. The officer shifted his weight slightly, eyes flicking from the man to the quiet street and back again, as if the ordinary surroundings might suddenly justify the tension hanging in the air. "I need to verify a few things," he said. "Please step back from the property." The man didn't raise his voice. He didn't move either. "Verify what?" "Exactly?" he asked. His tone measured, controlled. There was no challenge in his words, only clarity. "We received a suspicious activity report," the officer replied. Suspicious activity. The man glanced briefly at the front door of the house, the driveway beside it, the car parked where it always was. Then he looked back at the officer. "Entering my own home is considered suspicious?" he asked quietly. The officer's jaw tightened. His training urged him forward, to maintain command, to keep the upper hand. Yet something about the man's calm refusal to be rattled unsettled him. "I need to see your identification," the officer said again, firmer this time. "For my safety." The man nodded slowly. "I'm happy to cooperate," he said. "But before I do, I need to ask, am I being detained? Or am I free to go?" The officer hesitated. That pause, brief as it was, spoke volumes. His eyes darted down the street, then back to the man, searching for authority in a situation that was already beginning to slip beyond routine. "I just need to verify who you are," he said. The man exhaled softly, then spoke with quiet precision. "Officer, I will provide identification," he said. "But I want to be clear, there is no lawful basis for detaining me at this time." The air between them felt heavier now, charged with unspoken consequence. What had begun as a vague report and a casual assumption was rapidly becoming something far more serious, and neither man could pretend otherwise anymore. The man's hand hovered near the inside pocket of his suit jacket, and he paused deliberately before moving, ensuring the officer's eyes were fixed on every motion. "I'm going to retrieve my identification now," he said calmly. The officer straightened, muscles tensing. his hand drifting closer to his belt as instinct took over. He gave a short nod, watching carefully, slowly, deliberately. The man reached into his jacket and withdrew a rigid identification card. He raised it to chest level, holding it steady in the afternoon light. "This is my federal identification," he said. "I am the director of the Federal Homeland Oversight Agency." The words landed with quiet force. For a split second, the officer didn't respond. His eyes locked onto the card, scanning the embossed seal, the photograph, the official markings that were impossible to mistake. "I am standing in front of my residence," the man continued, his voice even and precise. "There is no probable cause for this stop." Traffic hummed faintly in the distance. Somewhere nearby, a door closed softly. A curtain shifted in an upstairs window. The officer swallowed, his expression tightening as training collided with reality. This was no longer a nameless face. No longer a routine encounter. The authority in the man's voice was not borrowed, it was earned. "Sir," the officer said at last, his voice strained but controlled, "you are being questioned based on a report. Please comply while I complete my investigation." The man didn't lower the ID. "I am cooperating," he replied. "But I am also asserting my rights under the Fourth Amendment. There is no legal basis for detention." The silence that followed was heavy. The balance of the encounter had shifted, and both men knew it. What should have ended in that moment did not. Instead, it became the point where everything began to go wrong. The silence didn't last. A front door creaked open down the street. A neighbor stepped onto the sidewalk, curiosity written plainly across her face. Another curtain shifted. Then another. The ordinary rhythms of the neighborhood began to fracture. A phone appeared in someone's hand. Then a second. Small, glowing rectangles pointed quietly toward the unfolding scene. "Why is he being stopped?" a voice whispered. "Isn't that his house?" someone else murmured. The officer felt it, the subtle but undeniable shift. What had once been a private assertion of authority was now a public performance. Every movement mattered. Every word carried weight. He took a step closer, the metal badge on his chest catching the sunlight. "Sir, step back and comply," he said, his voice firmer now. "I am conducting an investigation." The man didn't raise his voice. He didn't step away. "An investigation requires reasonable suspicion," he replied evenly. "You have not articulated any." The breeze stirred the leaves overhead. Somewhere, a dog barked again, sharp and sudden. Then quiet. The phones remained steady, lenses unblinking. The officer's jaw tightened. His hand hovered near his belt, fingers flexing unconsciously. Training told him to maintain control. Pride urged him forward. But the presence of witnesses complicated everything. Authority is easiest when no one is watching. Now, everyone was. The man remained still, ID held calmly at his chest. Posture relaxed but deliberate. His composure stood in stark contrast to the tension radiating from the officer. What had begun as a vague report had become a visible confrontation. And with every second that passed, the cost of the next decision grew heavier. The street had become more than a backdrop. It had become a witness. The man standing calmly on his own front steps hadn't always worn a tailored suit or carried himself with this kind of quiet authority. He was born in the heart of a crowded city, in a neighborhood where opportunity never arrived unannounced. His mother worked double shifts as a nurse, coming home exhausted but unbroken. His father taught in a public school, instilling discipline, curiosity, and an unshakable belief that the law, when understood, could be a shield instead of a weapon. From an early age, he learned how easily assumptions were made, how quickly suspicion followed certain faces, how often silence was safer than explanation. Education became his way forward. Scholarships earned through relentless effort. Internships in government offices where he listened more than he spoke. Law school nights spent poring over statutes, case law, and constitutional protections that too often existed only on paper. At 22, he entered federal service. Assigned to a unit tasked with overseeing civil rights compliance work that rarely made headlines and never offered shortcuts. He reviewed complaints others ignored, challenged practices deeply embedded in institutional routine, learned patience not as weakness, but as strategy. Years passed, then decades. By the time he reached his 40s, he had risen to direct a federal agency whose sole purpose was oversight, holding power accountable, even when it resisted. Across from him now stood a very different story. An officer raised in a quiet suburban town, drawn to law enforcement by the promise of order, authority, and purpose. Trained well, praised early, but over time, small misjudgments went uncorrected. Minor complaints accumulated. Patterns emerged, then faded into paperwork. Assumptions hardened into instinct. And on this quiet street, two lives shaped by vastly different lessons converged, each carrying the weight of years that would define the next few minutes. Neither man could fully escape the path that had led him here. The officer had worn the badge for 8 years. On paper, his record looked acceptable. Commendations from training, satisfactory performance reviews. Nothing that immediately raised alarms. But beneath the surface, a different pattern had quietly formed. 11 complaints, 8 years. Stops that escalated without clear cause. Searches that stretched the limits of justification. Encounters where suspicion seemed to arrive before evidence. Most were dismissed. Some quietly resolved. A few sustained but followed by little more than a warning and a note in a file. No intervention. No course correction. Over time, that silence became permission. Authority, when left unchecked, reshapes instinct. The officer learned to trust his gut more than procedure, to interpret uncertainty as threat, to equate compliance with control. Implicit bias rarely announces itself. It doesn't feel like prejudice. It feels like intuition, like experience, like being careful. And standing in front of him now was a man who defied the mental shortcuts he had grown accustomed to using. Calm, articulate, confident, unafraid. That contradiction created friction. The presence of neighbors and recording phones only intensified it. What should have de-escalated the situation instead sharpened the officer's sense that his authority was being challenged not just by the man, but by the watching crowd. Pride crept in where judgment should have stepped back. He could feel control slipping. And for someone trained to believe that control equaled safety, that loss felt dangerous. Across from him, the director remained steady, fully aware of what was unfolding. He recognized the signs not from theory, but from years of reviewing cases just like this. He had seen how small assumptions turned into unlawful actions, and he knew exactly where this was heading. Unless someone stopped it, the officer took a step closer. "Sir, I need you to step back now," he said, his voice sharper, edged with impatience. "This is your final instruction." The man did not move. His hands remained visible, his posture relaxed, deliberate. "Officer," he said calmly, "I am cooperating. But I need to be clear, this detention is unlawful." The words landed with precision. Not provocation, For a brief moment, there was a choice: de-escalate, reassess, walk away. Instead, the officer reached for his handcuffs. The metallic click echoed sharply in the warm afternoon air, cutting through the low murmurs of the crowd. A neighbor gasped. Someone whispered, "This is wrong. You are being placed under temporary detention," the officer announced. His voice loud now. Performative. "On what grounds?" the man asked. His tone steady, unwavering. The officer didn't answer. He stepped in and secured the cuffs around the man's wrists. The sound of metal closing was final. Irreversible. Cameras leaned in. Phones adjusted their angles. Every witness understood the gravity of what they were seeing. "I am not resisting," the man said evenly, "but I am asserting my rights under the Fourth Amendment. I have committed no crime." The officer avoided his eyes. What had begun as a vague report and a moment of suspicion had now crossed a legal line. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It was an unlawful detention, unfolding in full view of the public. And with that single decision, the officer set in motion consequences he could no longer control. The patrol car door opened with a hollow thud, and the man was guided into the back seat. The interior smelled faintly of disinfectant and warm plastic, a sterile contrast to the sunlit street he had just left behind. As the door closed, the outside world narrowed to glass and metal. The engine started. The low hum filled the space, joined by distant radio chatter that crackled without urgency. Houses slid past the windows in slow-motion driveways. Mailboxes. Curtains drawn just enough to watch without being seen. The man sat upright, his posture unchanged, his breathing steady. In his mind, the encounter was already being reconstructed with precision. Witnesses. Camera angles. The exact wording used the moment the handcuffs closed. Across the rearview mirror, the officer glanced back, then quickly forward again. He said nothing. The weight of the silence pressed down harder than words ever could. For the first time, doubt crept in. He replayed the moment he reached for the cuffs, the way the crowd reacted, the phones raised in unison, the unmistakable confidence in the man's voice when he asserted his rights. This did not feel like control. It felt like exposure. Each red light stretched longer than it should have. Each turn felt deliberate, heavy with consequence. Authority, once absolute, now felt fragile, caught between policy, perception, and proof. In the back seat, the man's gaze remained fixed forward, calm, focused, already preparing for what would come next. The street behind them faded from view, but it had already recorded everything. The police station smelled of bleach and old paper, a familiar blend of order and routine. Fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead as the man was escorted down a narrow hallway, the sound of his footsteps echoing against the linoleum floor. He took in the space instinctively. Camera placement, door angles. Who was watching? This was not his first time inside a station, but it was the first time he had entered one in handcuffs under these circumstances. The officer led him into a small processing room and removed the cuffs with deliberate, restrained movements. The metal clinked softly as they hit the desk. Moments later, the door opened again. A senior lieutenant stepped inside. 25 years on the force showed in the way he carried himself, measured, observant, unhurried. His eyes moved from the man to the officer, then back again. "Sir," the lieutenant said, his tone respectful but cautious. "May I see your identification once more?" The man reached into his briefcase and produced the federal ID. He placed it on the desk without a word. The lieutenant examined it carefully. The seal, the hologram, the signature line. His expression shifted. Subtle. Immediate. He looked up. Then back at the card. As if hoping to find a flaw that wasn't there. The officer shifted his weight uneasily. His confidence, already cracked, began to fracture entirely. The lieutenant inhaled slowly. "I'll need to verify this with headquarters," he said, already reaching for the phone. The room fell silent. And, in that silence, the truth settled in with undeniable weight. This was not a routine stop. This was a mistake, one that could not be undone. The call didn't take long. The lieutenant listened in silence, his expression tightening with each passing second. A few clipped responses. A quiet acknowledgement. Then he ended the call and placed the phone back on the desk with deliberate care. He looked at the man first. "Sir," he said, voice steady but unmistakably formal. "You are being released immediately." The words landed softly, but their impact was absolute. The officer stood frozen. His hands hovered uselessly at his sides as the reality of the situation fully settled in. This wasn't confusion anymore. This was confirmation. The lieutenant turned to him. "Remove the restraints." The cuffs were unlocked and lifted away. The faint red marks on the man's wrists stood in sharp contrast to his unshaken composure. He rose slowly, straightening his jacket, adjusting his cuffs not out of defiance, but control. Around them, the station continued its rhythm. Phones rang. Doors opened and closed. Life went on. Indifferent to the collapse of authority in that small room, the man gathered his briefcase. "I will be documenting this encounter in full," he said calmly. "Every action, every decision." The lieutenant nodded once. "We understand." The officer couldn't meet his eyes. What had begun as an assumption on a quiet street had now become a permanent record, one that would follow him long after this day ended. The balance of power had shifted, and there was no going back. By the time the man walked out of the station, uncuffed and composed, the story had already escaped the walls of the building. Videos recorded by neighbors began circulating within hours. A calm man in a suit stopped outside his own home, a badge demanding compliance without cause, handcuffs clicking shut while phones continued to roll. The internet reacted swiftly. Outrage, disbelief, anger. News outlets picked up the footage, replaying each moment frame by frame. Legal analysts dissected the stop. Civil rights attorneys weighed in. The question was no longer who the man was. It was why the stop happened at all. The city announced an internal investigation, then another external. Body camera footage was reviewed, dispatch logs examined. Past complaints resurfaced and were suddenly taken seriously. Patterns became impossible to ignore. The officer was placed on administrative leave. Pending review. Days later, that leave turned permanent. His badge was surrendered. His law enforcement career ended not with a dramatic confrontation, but with paperwork that documented every failure to intervene earlier. The lawsuit moved quickly. Video evidence, witness testimony, clear constitutional violations. Settlement discussions followed, public and substantial, reflecting both the severity of the incident and the city's acknowledgement of liability. But the consequences didn't stop with one officer. Policy reviews were ordered, training protocols revised, independent oversight strengthened. The system, exposed in daylight, was forced to respond. What had begun as a single unlawful stop had become a reckoning, and the cost of ignoring small abuses, paid all at once, was finally undeniable. What happened on that quiet suburban street was never just about one man or one officer. It was about how quickly rights can be stripped away when assumptions replace evidence. about how authority, when left unchecked, drifts from protection into control, and about how easily ordinary moments become extraordinary when power is exercised without accountability. Legally, the stop violated the Fourth Amendment clear and undeniable. No probable cause. No reasonable suspicion. Asserting one's rights is not obstruction, and it does not justify escalation. The law is explicit, even when enforcement forgets. But beyond legality, the incident revealed something deeper. Implicit bias does not announce itself loudly. It operates quietly, disguised as instinct, experience, or gut feeling. It shapes decisions before facts are considered and consequences understood. And when systems fail to challenge it, bias becomes behavior. In this case, cameras mattered. Witnesses mattered. Public scrutiny mattered. Without them, this story might never have reached daylight. Accountability often begins not inside institutions, but outside them when ordinary people observe, record, and refuse to look away. The man who stood calmly on his own front steps did not raise his voice. He did not resist. He relied on knowledge, composure, and the law itself. His response demonstrated a simple truth: rights are only powerful when they are understood and asserted. For viewers, the lesson is clear. Know your rights. Remain calm. Keep your hands visible. Document everything. Justice is not automatic. It is enforced by awareness, by courage, and by collective insistence on fairness. Because sometimes, the person dismissed as just another suspect is the one reminding the system what the law is actually supposed to mean. And sometimes, that reminder changes everything. Fade out.